Captain Maya Rodriguez had exactly 3 qualifications for interstellar diplomacy. She could fix a hyperdrive with duct tape, she spoke fluent sarcasm, and she happened to be the only human within 50 light years when the Galactic Council sent their invitation. Which, in retrospect, should have been her first red flag. The invitation itself was typical alien pretentiousness. Gold-plated, written in 17 languages, and delivered by a robot that insisted on scanning her DNA before speaking. Greetings, primitive carbon-based lifeform, it had announced cheerfully. The Galactic Council cordially invites humanity to witness the glory of advanced civilization. Maya had been elbow-deep in a plasma conduit when this happened, so her response was appropriately diplomatic. Yeah, sure, whatever. Just don't touch anything. Now, floating in her beat-up shuttle toward a space station the size of Manhattan, Maya was starting to think she should have read the fine print. The Celestial Harmony Station looked like someone had crossed a cathedral with a particle accelerator and then covered the whole thing in neon lights. Very subtle. The docking bay alone could have housed her entire hometown, and the welcoming committee was exactly what she'd expected from a species that communicated through interpretive dance and light shows. 3 aliens stood waiting, each more ridiculous than the last. Overlord Grex resembled a 7-foot iguana wearing a military uniform designed by someone who'd only heard fashion described secondhand. His scales literally sparkled, and Maya was pretty sure that wasn't natural. Ambassador Quillix looked like a praying mantis had been crossed with a nervous accountant. 4 arms, compound eyes, and a tendency to wring all 4 hands simultaneously while making chittering sounds that might have been anxiety or indigestion. High Counselor Vextar was apparently so advanced they'd evolved beyond having a physical form, existing as a floating cloud of energy that pulsed different colors when it talked. Maya immediately dubbed it the galaxy's most expensive lava lamp. "Welcome, tiny human," Grex boomed, his voice echoing off the docking bay walls. "We are so pleased you could join us for this momentous occasion." "Momentous occasion?" Maya asked, shouldering her toolkit. "I thought this was just a meet and greet." The 3 aliens exchanged what she assumed were glances, though with Vextar it was hard to tell. "Oh yes," Quillix chittered nervously. "A meeting indeed. A very important meeting about a very small problem we've been having." Maya's sarcasm detector started beeping. Define small. Grex's scales somehow managed to sparkle even brighter. "Well, there's been a minor territorial dispute. Nothing serious. Just a small war." "How small?" "Only about half the galaxy," Vextar pulsed helpfully. Maya stopped walking. "I'm sorry, did you just say half the galaxy?" "Oh yes," Quillix added, wringing all 4 hands. "It's been going on for about 500 years now. Give or take a decade." And that was when Maya realized she wasn't here as Earth's first diplomat. She was here as the galaxy's latest entertainment. The council chamber was exactly what Maya expected from a civilization that thought gold-plating invitations was a good idea. The ceiling disappeared into some kind of holographic sky, complete with slowly rotating nebulae and the occasional shooting star. The walls were covered in what looked like the galaxy's most expensive screensaver, and the furniture appeared to be made from crystallized space-time or something equally ridiculous. Around a table the size of a small planet sat representatives from dozens of species, all of whom turned to stare at Maya as she entered. She'd seen more intimidating crowds at her nephew's Little League games. "Behold," Grex announced dramatically, "the representative from the newly discovered species called humans." A ripple of what Maya assumed was polite applause went around the table, though some species clapped with tentacles, others with claws, and one appeared to be applauding with its tail. "Now then," Vextar pulsed, shifting to a businesslike shade of blue, "let us explain our small situation." What followed was the most convoluted explanation of a conflict Maya had ever heard, and she'd once had to mediate a dispute between 2 engineers over the proper way to calibrate a flux capacitor. The war, they explained, was between 2 major galactic powers, the Xantharian Collective and the Korthak Empire. The Xantharians were apparently the galaxy's accountants, approaching everything with methodical precision and an unhealthy obsession with spreadsheets. The Korthak Empire, on the other hand, made decisions based entirely on emotion and had never met a problem they couldn't solve by declaring it a matter of honor. The conflict, Quillix chittered nervously, began approximately 512 years, 4 months and 16 days ago. But who's counting? Maya muttered. We are, replied a Xantharian representative, a being that looked like a filing cabinet had achieved sentience. We have maintained precise records of every battle, casualty, and diplomatic failure. A Korthak delegate, who resembled a cross between a bear and a thunderstorm, slammed what Maya assumed was a fist on the table. Records mean nothing when honor is at stake. Our ancestors' blood cries out for vengeance. Your ancestors started this war over a catering mishap, the Xantharian replied dryly. It was not a mishap. It was an insult that shook the very foundations of our civilization. Maya raised her hand. I'm sorry, did you just say this war started over catering? The entire chamber fell silent. Grex cleared his throat, a sound like gravel in a blender. Well, you see, it's rather more complicated than that. I'm sure it is, Maya said. But humor me. What exactly happened 500 years ago? Vextar pulsed to a nervous yellow. There was a diplomatic dinner, a cultural exchange. The Xantharians invited the Korthak leadership to sample their traditional cuisine. And there was a translation error, Quillix admitted quietly. Maya waited. The invitation, the Xantharian representative said reluctantly, was supposed to read, "We invite you to dine with us as honored guests." What did it say instead? The Korthak delegate's fur was literally standing on end. It said, "We invite you to dine on us as honored guests." Maya blinked. So you've been fighting a 500-year war because someone used the wrong preposition? The silence stretched until Vextar pulsed defensively. It's much more complex than that. There have been territorial violations, resource disputes, cultural misunderstandings, all stemming from a typo. A very significant typo, Grex insisted. Maya looked around the chamber at dozens of supposedly advanced alien civilizations, all nodding gravely as if this made perfect sense. Right, and in 500 years nobody thought to just explain the mistake? Oh, we tried, Quillix chittered. We've had over 12,000 peace negotiations. 12,000? All failures, the Xantharian added helpfully. We have documented each one extensively. With full statistical analysis, the Korthak delegate growled, of why logic cannot overcome matters of honor. Maya was beginning to understand why they'd invited humanity to this party. They needed someone to watch the show. So Maya said, settling back in her chair, you've been fighting for 5 centuries over a dinner invitation, and you've held 12,000 failed peace talks. Have you considered just apologizing? The laughter that erupted from the council chamber sounded like a zoo at feeding time. Grex's scales were practically strobing with amusement. Quillix was chittering so hard Maya worried he might molt. And Vextar had shifted to what she assumed was the energy being equivalent of rolling on the floor laughing. Oh, that's precious, Grex wheezed between chuckles. Human logic is so delightfully simple. Simple. Maya's eyebrow shot up in the way that usually made junior engineers reconsider their life choices. My dear primitive friend, Vextar pulsed condescendingly, you cannot possibly understand the sophisticated nature of this conflict. Apologies are for minor infractions, not matters of galactic significance. A new voice spoke up from across the table. Ambassador Thexla looked like someone had crossed a peacock with a philosophy professor and given the result an unhealthy obsession with talking. The human suggests we simply say sorry and expect centuries of bloodshed to be forgotten. How charmingly naive. Maya felt her jaw clench. Naive? Oh yes, the XLA continued, preening feathers that shifted through every color of the rainbow. You see, we have consulted the greatest minds in the galaxy. The Zurian think tank spent 60 years analyzing this conflict. The quantum meditation masters of Altair contemplated it for a century. Even the AI collective of Proxima ran simulations for decades. And all concluded that the conflict is far too complex for simple solutions. Maya leaned forward. Let me get this straight. Your greatest minds spent decades analyzing a problem that started with a typo, and none of them suggested just explaining the typo. Explaining is insufficient, the Xantharian representative interjected. We have calculated the probability matrices, the cultural damage coefficients, the honor debt algorithms. The what now? Quillix wrung his hands nervously. Well, you see, when the Korthak felt insulted, they demanded satisfaction. But the Xantharians couldn't provide satisfaction without understanding the precise nature of the insult. So they filed a formal inquiry, which we interpreted as a further insult. The Korthak delegate rumbled. So we filed a counter-inquiry, which led to a formal protest, which escalated to a diplomatic incident, which required military intervention. Maya held up her hands. Stop, just stop. She looked around the chamber. So you turned a misunderstanding into a bureaucratic nightmare, and then you turned the bureaucratic nightmare into a war. It's more nuanced than that, the XLA insisted. Is it? None. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you spent 500 years making a simple problem infinitely more complicated because none of you wanted to admit you made a mistake. The chamber erupted in indignant protests. The human doesn't understand the cultural implications, someone shouted. The historical precedents are clear, another voice added. The psychological trauma matrices clearly indicate, a third began. Maya stood up. Psychological trauma matrices? Are you kidding me right now? Grex's scales had shifted to a patronizing shade of gold. My dear human, your species is very young. You cannot possibly comprehend the sophisticated approaches required for complex interstellar conflicts. Sophisticated approaches, Maya repeated slowly. Right. How's that working out for you? We are making progress, Vextar pulsed defensively. After 500 years and 12,000 failed negotiations, you call this progress? Rome wasn't built in a day, Thexale said smugly. Maya stared at him. Did you just quote human history at me while telling me humans don't understand complex problems? The silence that followed could have been used to calibrate scientific instruments. Furthermore, Maya continued, her voice gaining that dangerous edge that made even seasoned mechanics nervous. Has anyone actually asked the Xantharians and Korthak what they want? Not what their governments want, not what their ancestors wanted, but what they actually want right now. More silence. Because from what I've heard, you've got accountants fighting warriors over a catering misunderstanding, and nobody's bothered to ask if maybe, just maybe, they're all tired of shooting at each other over something nobody remembers caring about. The Xantharian representative shifted uncomfortably. Well, the original grievance is well documented. But what about now? What do you want now? The question hung in the air like a bad smell. The uncomfortable silence stretched until Maya thought she could hear the space-time continuum creaking under the weight of 500 years of accumulated bureaucratic nonsense. Finally, the Xantharian representative spoke up. We want the Korthak to acknowledge that the original translation error was not intentional mockery. The Korthak delegate's fur rippled. We want the Xantharians to understand that honor, once questioned, must be restored. Maya waited for more. When nothing came, she said, "That's it." Well, Quillix chittered nervously, there are also the territorial disputes. which started because the war required strategic positioning and the resource conflicts. Military supply lines, the Xantharian admitted. And the cultural misunderstandings? Propaganda campaigns, the Korthak said quietly. Maya sat back down, slowly. So let me see if I understand this. You started fighting over a typo. The fighting created new problems. You fought over those problems, which created more problems. And now you're fighting over problems that only exist because you were fighting in the first place. It's a complex feedback loop, Thixele said defensively. It's the stupidest thing I've ever heard, and I once watched a guy try to fix a plasma leak with chewing gum. Vextar pulsed to an offended shade of red. The human lacks the intellectual capacity to understand sophisticated conflict dynamics. Sophisticated? Maya's voice could have cut through titanium. You want to know what's sophisticated? I'll tell you what's sophisticated. She stood up and began pacing, which was impressive given that the alien chairs weren't designed for human proportions. Sophisticated is the military-industrial complex you've built around this war. I did some reading on my way here. You know what I found? The Galactic Defense Consortium has tripled in size since this war started. The Interstellar Arms Corporation has offices in every major system. The conflict. Resolution Institute has a waiting list 3 decades long. The chamber had gone very quiet. You've got entire generations of aliens who've never known peace. You've got military contractors who retire to private moons. You've got peace negotiators who've made careers out of failing to end this war. The human implies conspiracy, Grex said stiffly. I'm not implying anything. I'm saying it straight out. You've industrialized warfare, bureaucratized conflict, and professionalized incompetence. This isn't a war anymore. It's a jobs program. Quillix's chittering had reached a frequency that was probably giving nearby dogs headaches. But the historical grievances. They're 500 years old. The beings who were actually insulted are dead. The beings who did the insulting are dead. You're fighting a war on behalf of dead people over something that was an accident in the first place. Maya turned to address the entire chamber. And you know what the really sophisticated part is? You've convinced yourselves that this is too complex to solve because complexity is your brand. You're not the galaxy's great thinkers. You're the galaxy's great overthinkers. The human's primitive psychology cannot grasp the nuanced requirements of interstellar diplomacy, Thixele protested. Primitive psychology? Maya's laugh had zero humor in it. Let me tell you about primitive psychology. When humans have a problem, we try to fix it. When the fix doesn't work, we try something else. When that doesn't work, we try again. We don't spend 5 centuries analyzing why the problem is unfixable. She looked around the chamber, making eye contact with as many aliens as possible. You want to know the real reason this war hasn't ended? It's not because it's too complex. It's because ending it would mean admitting you've been wrong for 500 years. And you'd rather keep fighting than admit you made a mistake. The silence that followed was so complete Maya could hear her own heartbeat. Then, from the back of the chamber, a small voice spoke up. It was a young Xantharian, barely old enough to have his own filing cabinet. I'm tired of fighting, he said quietly. A young Korthak near the front nodded. So am I. I never even understood what we were fighting about, another voice added. My great-grandfather died in this war, someone else said. I don't even know his name. More voices joined in, a chorus of exhaustion that had been building for centuries. Maya watched as the reality of their situation finally began to sink in. They weren't fighting a war. They were maintaining one. The confession session that followed was like watching 500 years of galactic therapy happening in fast forward. Aliens who had been mortal enemies for centuries started admitting they couldn't remember why they hated each other. Military commanders confessed they'd been following orders that made no sense. Diplomats acknowledged that their peace negotiations had become more about job security than actual peace. Maya let them talk, watching as the weight of half a millennium's worth of accumulated stupidity finally began to settle on the chamber. It was like watching a massive, galactic-sized penny drop. Finally, when the confessions died down to exhausted whispers, Maya stood up again. "Okay," she said, her voice cutting through the chamber like a hot knife through butter. "I'm going to say something, and I want everyone to listen carefully because I'm only going to say it once." The chamber fell silent. Even the holographic nebulae seemed to pause in their rotation. Maya looked directly at the Xantharian representative, then at the Korthak delegate, then back at the assembled crowd of supposedly advanced civilizations who had spent 5 centuries proving that intelligence and wisdom were not the same thing. What if you both just said sorry and moved on? The reaction was immediate and predictable. Grex's scales flashed through what Maya was pretty sure was the reptilian equivalent of a seizure. Thexele's feathers went through every color of the spectrum twice. Vextar pulsed so rapidly he looked like a strobe light having an existential crisis. "Impossible," Grex sputtered. Primitive, Thexela squawked. Reductive, Vextar strobed. Maya held up one hand, and somehow, incredibly, they all shut up. "Let me explain something to you about human conflict resolution," she said. "When my neighbor's dog craps on my lawn, I don't file a formal complaint with the homeowners association. I don't hire a lawyer. I don't declare a blood feud that lasts for generations. You know what I do?" She paused for effect. "I knock on his door and say, 'Hey, your dog crapped on my lawn. Can you clean it up and maybe keep him on a leash?' And you know what he says? He says, 'Oh crap, sorry about that. I'll clean it up right now and make sure it doesn't happen again.' And then you know what happens? Problem solved. We go back to being neighbors." But the cultural implications, Quillick started. The cultural implications of what? Of admitting mistakes? Of taking responsibility? Of acting like adults instead of cosmic toddlers having a 500-year tantrum? Maya turned to the Xantharian representative. "You made a translation error. You didn't mean to insult anyone. It was an accident." "Say so." The Xantharian shifted uncomfortably. "But the procedural requirements for formal acknowledgement of error." "Are you sorry it happened?" "Well, yes." "Then say that." She turned to the Korthak delegate. "Your people got insulted over something that wasn't intentional. You've been fighting ever since. Are you tired of fighting?" The Korthak's fur had settled to what Maya assumed was a thoughtful pattern. "Ah, yes, we are tired." "Then say that." Maya looked around the chamber. "This isn't rocket science, people. This is basic human interaction. You hurt someone accidentally, you apologize. Someone apologizes to you, you accept it and move on. The only reason this has lasted 500 years is because you've all convinced yourselves that simple solutions can't work. But the complexity of interstellar relations, Thexela protested weakly, is exactly as complex as you make it. You've taken a 5-minute conversation and turned it into a 5-century war because you're all too proud to admit that maybe, just maybe, you've been overthinking this." The chamber was so quiet Maya could hear the space station's life support systems humming. Then, slowly, the Xantharian representative stood up. "Korthak delegation," he said formally. We are sorry. The translation error was unintentional. We never meant to insult your honor or your culture." The Korthak delegate rose as well, his massive frame casting shadows across the chamber. "Xantharian collective," he replied, his voice rumbling like distant thunder. "We accept your apology. We are also sorry. Sorry for letting pride turn accident into war." The two beings looked at each other across the chamber, across 500 years of bloodshed and bureaucracy. Then the Korthak delegate did something that Maya was pretty sure hadn't happened in half a millennium. He smiled, and extended his hand. The Xantharian looked at the offered hand for a long moment, then reached out and shook it. The chamber erupted, not in protest or outrage, but in something Maya hadn't expected to hear in a galactic war council. Applause. Wow. 3 months later, Maya found herself back in the council chamber. But this time the atmosphere was completely different. The holographic nebulae seemed brighter, the crystallized space-time furniture looked less pretentious, and nobody was arguing about on-or-dead algorithms or cultural damage coefficients. The Xantharian-Korthak War, as historians were already calling it, had officially ended with what was probably the shortest peace treaty in galactic history. The entire document was 2 sentences long. "We're sorry this happened. Let's not do it again." Maya had suggested they frame it. "The economic implications have been extraordinary," Quillix chittered happily, waving a data pad that was probably full of statistics Maya didn't want to hear. "Military spending down 90%, trade up 300%, and we've converted 87 weapons factories into schools. And the cultural exchange programs are exceeding all projections," added TXLA, whose feathers had settled into a perpetually cheerful shade of blue. "Turns out Korthak cuisine is actually quite good when it's not being served as a prelude to invasion." Maya nodded politely while wondering how these beings had managed to survive as long as they had. "That's great. Really. I'm happy for everyone." Grex, whose scales had developed a new pattern that Maya was told indicated deep respect, leaned forward eagerly. "Which brings us to our proposal." Maya's danger sense, honed by years of dealing with exploding hyperdrives and bureaucratic nonsense, started beeping. "Proposal?" "The council has voted unanimously," Vextar pulsed in what were apparently festive colors. "We want to offer you the position of Chief of Common Sense." "The what now?" "Chief of Common Sense," Grex repeated. "With full diplomatic immunity, a salary that would make a Ferengi weep, and your own moon." Maya blinked. "You want to give me a moon?" "A small moon," Quillix clarified. "Very tasteful. Good schools." "We've realized," TXLA said seriously, "that in all our sophistication we may have lost sight of some basic principles." "Such as?" "Mom." "Such as talking to each other instead of about each other. Such as solving problems instead of analyzing them. Such as admitting when we're wrong instead of finding complex ways to avoid being wrong." Maya looked around the chamber at dozens of alien faces, all looking at her with something that might have been hope. "You want me to teach the galaxy common sense?" "It's not as easy as it sounds," Vextar pulsed defensively. "We've tried to systematize it, but somehow that defeats the purpose." "Because," Maya said slowly, "the point of common sense is that it's supposed to be common, not systematized." "Exactly," Grex said, his scales practically sparkling with excitement. "You see, you're already better at this than our entire Department of Practical Philosophy." "You have a Department of Practical Philosophy?" Quillix corrected. "We disbanded it last week. Turns out practical philosophy is just common sense with a bigger budget." Maya sat back in her chair, which the aliens had thoughtfully replaced with something designed for human proportions. "Let me get this straight. You want me to stay here and teach advanced alien civilizations how to use basic common sense?" "When you put it like that, it sounds ridiculous," TXLA admitted. "It is ridiculous," Maya said, "which is exactly why it might work." 6 months later, Maya stood in front of a lecture hall filled with beings from across the galaxy. The sign outside read, "Remedial Logic for Advanced Civilizations, Professor Rodriguez, Chief of Common Sense." "Okay, everyone," she said, looking out at an audience that included former military commanders, diplomatic ministers, and at least 3 Nobel Prize equivalents. Today we're going to talk about a revolutionary concept called asking questions before declaring war. A tentacled being in the front row raised what Maya assumed was a hand. But what if the questions are complex? Maya smiled. Then you ask simpler questions until you get simple answers. Remember, complexity is usually just simplicity wearing a disguise. But what about cultural sensitivities? Asked a crystalline entity from the back. What about them? Well, shouldn't we have a framework for addressing cross-cultural miscommunication protocols? Maya sighed. And this is just a crazy idea when you don't understand something someone from another culture does. You could try asking them what they meant instead of assuming they're trying to insult you. The crystalline being was quiet for a moment. That's so simple it might actually work. Most good ideas are simple, Maya said. The trick is not talking yourself out of them because they seem too easy. A young Xantharian raised his filing cabinet equivalent of a hand. Professor Rodriguez, what if we encounter a problem that really is too complex for simple solutions? Maya grinned. Then break it down into smaller problems until you find ones that aren't too complex. There's no law that says you have to solve everything at once. But what about efficiency? The student pressed. What's more efficient, solving a problem quickly or spending 500 years not solving it because you're afraid the solution might be too simple? The class fell silent as that particular piece of logic sank in. Now then, Maya continued, who can tell me the 3 basic steps of human conflict resolution? A dozen hands, tentacles, pseudopods, and energy fields shot up. Step 1, called out a former Korthak general, ask what the problem actually is. Step 2, added a retired Xantharian diplomat, ask what each side actually wants. And step 3? Maya prompted. Find the simplest solution that gives everyone enough of what they want that they can live with it, the class said in unison. Maya nodded approvingly. Very good. And if that doesn't work? Try again, they chorused, but simpler. Excellent. Your homework for next week is to find one unnecessarily complicated problem in your daily life and solve it using today's techniques. Remember, if your solution requires more than 3 sentences to explain, you're probably overthinking it. As the class filed out, chattering excitedly about the radical concept of straightforward problem solving, Maya allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. Sure, she'd started out as an accidental diplomat who'd stumbled into the galaxy's longest-running war. But she'd ended up as something much more important. The person who'd taught the universe's smartest beings that sometimes the best answer to how do we solve this complex problem is have you tried turning it off and turning it back on again? And if that wasn't worth a small moon and diplomatic immunity, Maya didn't know what was. Besides, someone had to keep an eye on these aliens. Left to their own devices, they'd probably find a way to start a war over the proper way to say please and thank you. Maya made a mental note to add basic politeness for beginners to next semester's curriculum. After all, the galaxy's peace depended on it.